My name is Lena Marquez, and I grew up in a house where every smile hid a secret and every word carried a price. My stepmother spoke in Spanish to keep her lies safe, never realizing I understood every syllable. When I uncovered a hidden fortune and a betrayal buried for years, I didn't shout. I waited. And on the night of my father's grand anniversary, their perfect world shattered under the weight of my silence. Sometimes revenge doesn't need anger. It needs patience. Tell me, where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more true revenge stories. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know how far this story has traveled and how many of you believe that sometimes revenge doesn't need to scream. It only needs to speak once in the right language. I returned to Sedona for my father's 27th wedding anniversary, a celebration I neither wanted nor could avoid. The house looked unchanged, bathed in warm light polished to perfection, yet filled with that same heavy quiet that money often buys. People smiled too long, too carefully. My stepmother, Isabel, was born in Madrid, and she wore her accent like a crown, deliberate, lyrical, and always reminding everyone she was the one with sophistication. Over the years, she'd mastered the art of turning Spanish into a private fortress. Inside that fortress, I was never invited. Dinner began as usual, the symphony of silverware, glasses clinking, and polite laughter that never reached anyone's eyes. My younger half-sister Mara, always poised beside her mother, leaned in close and spoke in fluent Spanish, her voice sweet but barbed. Ella habla mucho, pero nunca hace nada. She talks big but does nothing. My father chuckled softly, not understanding the sting in her tone. Isabel gave a slight nod, her lips curving faintly. They thought their secret language still kept me outside their walls. They were wrong. I didn't flinch. My hand remained still on my glass. Every nerve in me wanted to react, to pierce that smug silence, but I smiled instead, the kind of smile that hides both fury and calculation. Years of being dismissed had taught me one thing: silence can slice deeper than any word. That night, something inside me shifted. I decided I would no longer sit quietly while they built their world on exclusion and deceit. They didn't know that I'd understood every syllable they'd whispered. They didn't know that my silence would soon become their downfall. Before I continue, tell me, what time is it where you're watching from? And which city are you in? I want to know how far this story has traveled. The next morning, the house felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. Every family has its hierarchy. Ours was built the day my father remarried. I was only 5 when Victor Marquez married Isabel, the woman who would become my stepmother. I still remember that day vividly, the red cliffs of Sedona glowing behind them, her silk dress fluttering like a flag, and the way she said my father's name, Victor, like it was a song. Everyone around whispered that she was exactly what he needed. I didn't understand then. Months later, Isabel was pregnant. My father was euphoric. He painted the nursery himself, choosing soft yellow and mint green, humming as he worked. I stood at the doorway, small and invisible. When Mara was born, Isabel's Spanish relatives flooded our home. The air smelled of saffron and jasmine, voices fast and musical, words I didn't know but somehow understood meant I didn't belong. They'd smile politely at me, then switch to Spanish and laugh. My father pretended not to notice. Growing up in that house was like living between two worlds, English and Spanish, never belonging to either. At breakfast, I'd talk about my drawings or school projects, and Isabel would respond to my father in Spanish, smooth and dismissive, sealing me out. He'd nod vaguely, replying in English, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. Mara became the center of everything. Isabel adored her, and my father followed suit. They called her our bright one. I was the calm one, the independent one. Compliments wrapped in distance. Isabel's kindness always had an edge. She'd praise my art, then suggest I try something more practical. She'd tell people she admired my independence, meaning, you're on your own. My father never corrected her. He'd just smile, hold her hand, and change the subject. I used to think that was love. Now, I know it was fear of conflict, or perhaps complacency disguised as peace. By the time I was 15, I had learned the geography of silence in that house. When Victor came home from work, Isabel would switch to Spanish to discuss money. When she was angry, her voice dropped to a low hum behind closed doors. When her relatives called, she'd step into the garden, her sentences clipped and deliberate. I didn't understand every word, but I recognized tone, the same tone people use when they make decisions that change lives. Whenever I asked my father to explain, he'd sigh. You know how your stepmother gets when she's stressed? He'd say, it's not important. But everything that was not important defined my life. Mara, on the other hand, moved easily between languages, fluent in both privilege and approval. By the age of 10, she already mirrored her mother's confidence and quiet arrogance. When guests came, she'd sit beside our father, translating for him, always with that perfect smile that said, I belong. I'd sit across the table, pretending it didn't bother me. Once when I was 16, I overheard Isabel telling Mara on the patio, you must always be better than her. People only remember the one who wins. Mara laughed softly, and I realized I wasn't being raised as a daughter. I was being raised as a comparison. My father never saw it. He lived in orbit around Isabel's moods, mistaking peace for love. Your stepmother means well, he'd say, you two will grow closer someday. But love in our house had conditions: obedience, silence, and Spanish fluency. When I left for college, Isabel hugged me for the first time. You're such a strong girl, she said. Don't forget to write your father. Not us. Him. I thought distance would fix things. It didn't. Holidays were the same performance. Same table, same hierarchy, same unspoken wall. Isabel and Mara talked. Victor smiled. I played the part of the distant daughter. One Christmas, Mara flipped through my sketchbook and smirked. You still draw? Dad says you could have joined his firm if you were serious. I said nothing. Isabel smiled without looking up. She's creative, darling, but not everyone's meant for business. She said it in English this time, to make sure I heard. That was the thing about Isabel. She knew exactly when to translate cruelty. Years later, when I opened my own design firm, my father congratulated me with polite surprise. That's wonderful, Lena, he said. You've always been independent. He said it like a compliment. It wasn't. Mara sent a 2-word text. Proud of you. No period. No heart. Isabel said nothing. That was our family love, rationed, distant, conditional. But over time, I realized my silence hadn't been submission. It had been survival. Every time I bit my tongue, every time I walked away, I wasn't weak. I was observing, waiting. They thought silence meant acceptance. They were wrong. Silence was my education. It was how I learned their language and how I planned to destroy their lives with their own words. I already had the recording saved, labeled carefully, foundation. I drove to the city without announcing it, hands tight on the wheel, that envelope Renee had given me folded against my thigh like a secret heartbeat. Every mile north felt like pulling at a thread I hadn't known existed. By the time I met her in the rain-streaked cafe, the paper between us smelled faintly of old offices and decisions made to look like accidents. She handed me names: accountants who'd left quietly, a bank clerk who'd retired with too much discretion, an old associate who'd been suddenly reassigned. Each name was a handle on the thing I meant to pull apart. When I listened to her, I stopped feeling like a child and started feeling like a strategist. Caleb had been my partner since before the firm had a proper client list. He knew how to make things work without calling attention to himself. His calm was the exact complement to my impatience. When I called him, I didn't ask for advice. I told him what I planned and where to stand. "Timing is everything," he said, and his voice carried the same steady certainty I'd relied on through every deadline and pitch. He was the quiet wire behind the scenes the way I was the visible face. We agreed on a single rule: let the evidence do the talking. Fury would be a luxury I couldn't afford. Back at the house, the rhythm of the household surprised me with its normalcy. Isabel moved through entertaining like a conductor, every gesture precise, every laugh set to the tempo she chose. Victor smiled the way men do when they've been trained to believe in an image they helped create. Mara glided about in a dress that matched her mother's discretion, always pale, always impeccable. From the window of my old room, the party lights below looked like a constellation I once wanted to belong to. Now, they looked like a stage. The plan itself was small in conception and dramatic in execution. Caleb and I would hijack the evening's slideshow, a tribute to the marriage, to Victor's supposed generosity. We didn't plan to yell, to storm the stage, or to make speeches. We set a handful of facts to replace their myths: photocopies, wire transfers, signatures that matched Victor's, and a ledger line that led straight to an account in Isabel's name overseas. We arranged it to play slowly, each frame a nail. The audience would see it, and the silence following would be louder than any argument. I felt none of the rush I'd expected when the lights dimmed and Marina took the microphone. Instead, there was a curious smallness to my nerves, an awareness that whatever happened next would change the geometry of our lives. I wore navy because it read as composed. My heels were more practical than ornament. Caleb was at the laptop, his fingers ghosting over keys. He gave me one of those looks that said, "Now." I rose, walked forward, and when my heels clicked against marble, it sounded like a countdown. The screen blossomed into the perfect, polished tribute, pictures of smiles, a soundtrack of nostalgia, and then it faltered. A hush fell like a drawn curtain. The next image that appeared had nothing to do with family albums. A scan page of bank transfers with a stamp that read confidential, and a line that traced funds to an account whose beneficiary name I'd read enough times to feel it crawl under my skin: Isabel Alvarez. You could hear the breath of the room leave. Faces turned. Murmurs started. Then a ripple of confusion became a current of dismay. Victor's smile froze. Isabel's color drained the way light fades from a painting. Mara rushed forward, hands flailing. "Turn it off," she hissed, panic sharpening her voice into an edge I'd never heard. But the laptop sat under Caleb's control, like a calm animal. He had locked the feed. The screen continued, and with each page the architecture of their story cracked. There were signatures, dates, intermediary accounts, all pieces that when put side by side stopped being whispers and became a pattern. Victor rose as if pulled by a spring wound too tight. "Isabel, what is this?" he asked, bewilderment heavy in the question. He looked as if someone had flipped the coordinates of his world, and he didn't know which map to read. Isabel's mouth opened, closed, and her hands flew to the pearls at her throat as if for defense. People clustered into small islands of judgment and curiosity. I walked to the front not because I wanted to dictate the ending, but because I wanted to watch it unfold in truth. "You called me talkative," I said quietly, my voice even and measured. "You laughed about my mother. You thought your language kept me out of your plans." The words landed, and the room listened. It's curious how quickly people will shift their attention when a narrative they paid for begins to look like deceit. I didn't shout, I didn't plead. I simply held up the phone and pushed play, the recording of them arranging a hidden account and mocking my mother's absence. their private cadence spilled into the open air, unadorned, and once so safe. You could feel the room tilt, the air rearrange. Isabel's face contorted with anger first, then a dawning calculation. "Lena, how dare you?" she began, voice rising in that precise, practiced way she used for indignation. But indignation without facts is like a roof without beams. The facts were on the screen, on my phone, in the envelope Renee had given me. Guests who'd been laughing moments before now looked at Victor with a new and brittle light. Old associates from his company exchanged glances that were not friendly. People remember the one who wins, Isabel had told Mara years ago. The room was deciding who had actually won. Victor's expression slid from confusion to something like shame. He was not a cruel man. He had been careful to arrange his life to avoid conflict, to believe what he was told because he preferred the peace it purchased. He moved toward Isabel as if stepping into a room that no longer matched the blueprint in his head. "Isabel, explain this," he said, voice smaller now. She faltered, then waved a hand, the grand gesture of someone used to writing the script. "She's making things up," Isabel said, precise and cold. "These are doctored. This is a smear." The word hung, thin and implausible. You could almost hear the lawyers lining up. And there it was, the first tactical retreat into disbelief, the way people use the legal future as armor against present truth. But truth does not care for lawyers' timetables. A woman at the back, a longtime friend of my father's, stood up. "These are bank stamps," she said, voice trembling. "I've seen ledgers like this. You can't fake treasury stamps without leaving a trail." Others nodded. Whispers rippled into directions that couldn't be contained. Marta, an accountant my father used to consult, stepped forward and spoke with the kind of bluntness truth gives those who've spent a life in numbers. "This matches transfer dates when Victor was on business trips alone," she said. "Someone with access has been moving funds." Her eyes flicked to Isabel without needing an interpreter. Isabel's face hardened. She moved to the podium, microphone in hand, and tried to salvage the evening with practiced charm and practiced outrage. "This is a betrayal," she declared, words sharpened for spectacle. "Victor, who we built our life with," she gestured at him, co-opted him back into a role of victim. Mara began crying, a well-rehearsed sob that invited pity. Guests split into factions. Those who clung to the comfort of the old story, and those who had just watched a carefully constructed lie slide from its frame. What followed was a slow cascade. Phone calls, the hum of hushed debates in corners, the quiet departure of a few guests who wanted no part of scandal. Victor sat down as if the floor had been pulled from beneath him. He seemed smaller, like a painting with its frame removed. Isabel tried legal threats, calling in a voice that promised lawyers and slander suits. But even threats are less effective once witnesses multiply. The evening disintegrated into a brittle, formal end. In the days that followed, the house became a field of shifting alliances. Some relatives shunned me as a tremor. Others called to ask what I had. The local paper, the sort that thrives on small-town gravity, picked up murmurs and called for comment. Caleb and I did not seek the spotlight. We let the evidence speak. People started asking hard questions. An auditor my father had known for 20 years requested a meeting. A bank official, summoned by a journalist who smelled a story, paused, then said, "We'll need to see corporate authorization forms." These are serious allegations. Serious, yes, and suddenly plausible. Victor, when he spoke to me privately, sounded like a man newly unmoored. "How could they?" he asked, and there was a tremor in his voice I couldn't remember from my childhood. There was grief in it, but it wasn't aimed at me. "I never wanted this," he said. It was true in a way that pierced. He had never wanted confrontation. He'd wanted comfort. Isabel had offered him an architecture of ease, and he had welcomed it. It's easier to believe in someone who flatters you than in the one who points out the cracks. Isabel, in contrast, became smaller in her fury and larger in her tactics. She pushed for private settlements, warning of legal ruin if these claims continued. She called on friends, on the language of reputation and dignity, to rally against the embarrassment. Yet each call that attempted to close ranks felt increasingly like rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. What I hadn't counted on was how personal this would get. They came for Renee's reputation, the way people will kick at a wound to see blood, questioning her motives, dredging up the past, pointing to her leaving as proof of instability. I watched as my mother was painted into a caricature, the deserter, the unreliable woman. But my evidence was not only about the past. It was about now. It was about the money moving in real time and the signatures that matched. There were consequences, legal notices, an initial internal audit at my father's company, and finally, the quiet but decisive move by an outside investigator who, once shown the ledger and the recordings, did not look at us like conspirators, but like people finally naming what had been hidden. The house that had once offered me a pit of cold comfort now felt like a fragile theater set. Walls can be repainted, but ledgers and wire transfers leave scars that don't wash away with a coat of polish. Still, even as the public pattern emerged and people began to speak in franker tones, I knew the hardest moves were yet to come. Isabel would not go quietly. She had learned how to move in rooms and bend stories to her will. Victor would have to choose between love and truth, between the image he'd cherished and the integrity he'd always meant to hold. And Mara, sweet, practiced Mara, would find her loyalties tested in ways a child trained to perform seldom anticipates. I slept the first night after the exposure like someone who had climbed a mountain and discovered the peak was only the beginning of a longer range. The real fight, the one that would either clear our name or leave us with new scars, was still ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in that house for years, the simple, fierce satisfaction of being seen. The morning light over Sedona came in pale and indifferent, as if the sun itself didn't want to be part of what followed. Reporters had already begun circling, the kind that smell scandal like blood. My father's company, once synonymous with clean contracts and local philanthropy, was under scrutiny. I watched from the kitchen window as a pair of men in suits arrived, their cars idling like punctuation marks in the long driveway. Isabel stood at the center of it all, elegant, composed, even as her empire trembled. Mara hovered near her mother, loyal and frightened, her phone glued to her hand, as if she could still control the story through filtered posts and silence. Victor hadn't spoken much since the party. He moved like a man halfway between grief and awakening, the kind who finally sees the frame that's held the picture for decades and realizes the wood has been rotting all along. I waited until the auditors left before stepping into his study, the same place where, as a child, I'd once stood in the doorway holding drawings he never had time to see. Now he sat behind the same oak desk, the weight of his own name pressing on him like a burden. "Lena," he said, voice hoarse, "why didn't you come to me first?" I looked at him, at the man who had chosen blindness as his refuge. "Would you have believed me?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was proof enough. He reached for the pile of documents I'd printed, the ones Renee had kept all those years. His eyes moved over each line, slower, more deliberate. When he reached Isabel's signature, something inside him folded. "My God," he whispered, "all this time?" "Yes," I said quietly, "all this time." He rubbed his forehead, trying to gather pieces of his reality that no longer fit. "And your mother, Renee, she knew?" "She tried to tell you," I said. "You just didn't want to listen." The truth sat between us like smoke, visible, choking, impossible to grasp. Outside, I could hear Isabel's voice rising, brittle with defiance, instructing Mara to call her lawyer again. Victor turned toward the window, eyes dark. "I loved her," he said simply. "I know," I replied. "That's why she could do this." For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice stripped of authority, he whispered, "I need to make this right." "Then start by listening," I said. That afternoon, I called Renee. When she picked up, I could hear the tremor in her breath. "It's happening," I told her. "He knows now." There was silence, then a soft, almost disbelieving sigh. "Lena," she said, "be careful. People like Isabel don't lose gracefully." She was right. By evening, Isabel's composure cracked. She stormed into Victor's study, her heels striking the marble like gavel blows. "How dare you bring outsiders into our private matters?" she hissed, her accent thickened by fury. "Do you realize what you've done to this family's name?" Victor looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "You already did that, Isabel." Her face went still, then cold. "So you're taking her side now? The daughter who's always resented me." "I'm taking the side of the truth," he said. "Something you forgot how to do." The silence that followed was electric. For the first time in years, I saw fear flicker across Isabel's perfect mask. Not because of exposure, but because she was losing control. She turned to me, then, voice sharp and venomous. "You think you've won, don't you?" I met her gaze, steady. "Winning was never the goal. You taught me that people remember the one who wins. I'd rather be remembered as the one who told the truth." Her lips curled into something almost like a smile, bitter, brittle, poisonous. "You have no idea what you've started." She wasn't wrong. Over the next week, the house became a revolving door of investigators, lawyers, and whispers. Isabel's accounts were frozen pending review. Victor's company board called an emergency meeting, and Mara, sweet, calculating Mara, finally cracked under pressure. I found her one morning sitting in the garden, eyes red from crying. "You think she did this alone?" she asked suddenly. "You think Mom didn't have help?" I studied her carefully. "Who helped her?" She hesitated, then looked at the ground. "Uncle Javier. The foundation transfers. He set them up years ago. Mom said it was for tax reasons. I didn't know until she told me to sign something last month. She said Dad didn't need to know." That confirmation hit like a final nail. I pressed record again. Not to trap her, but to protect the truth. "Mara," I said quietly, "you can fix this. You can tell the auditors everything." Her jaw trembled. "If I do, she'll never forgive me." "Then you'll finally be free," I said. When the report went public, the fallout was swift. Isabel's assets were seized. Her name splashed across headlines that once praised her charity galas. Javier disappeared abroad within days, his accounts under investigation. Mara, trembling but resolute, gave her statement. And Victor, broken but finally awake, resigned from his company to cooperate fully with the inquiry. The night the news broke, I sat alone in the courtyard, the same place where years ago I'd listened to laughter I wasn't meant to understand. The air smelled of rain and release. Victor came out quietly and sat beside me. For a long time, we said nothing. Then he spoke, voice heavy with something like humility. "You saved me," he said. I shook my head. "No, Dad. I just stopped pretending." He looked at me, eyes tired but clearer than I'd ever seen them. "I should have listened. To you. To your mother. To myself. It's not too late," I said. "Just start over, with the truth this time." He nodded slowly. "And you? What will you do now?"